The night sky over the Illinois countryside was clear, the stars scattered across the heavens like pinpricks in a dark canvas. Judge Marcus Whitfield adjusted his grip on the steering wheel as he guided his black Mercedes down the empty highway. He'd always found the stillness of late-night drives soothing, a rare moment to think without interruption. The applause from earlier that evening echoed faintly in his mind, a standing ovation from an audience of young, idealistic law students. In his lecture, he had spoken about justice, about the systemic barriers that people like him had to overcome. He'd drawn from his own life, growing up in Chicago's South Side, surrounded by poverty and crime. But through sheer determination and an unshakable belief in fairness, he had climbed the ladder of success. Now, as a federal judge, his name carried weight across the nation. He was a symbol of resilience, a beacon for those still fighting the battles he had won. But symbols, he knew, could be targets. As Marcus rounded a gentle curve in the road, the sudden flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror jolted him out of his thoughts. His heart sank. It was an instinctive reaction, one he'd experienced countless times before. The flashing lights had a way of reducing even the most accomplished man to a state of vulnerable uncertainty. He glanced at the speedometer. He hadn't been speeding. The road was deserted. There was no other traffic. So why was he being stopped? Sighing, Marcus signaled and pulled over to the shoulder. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he came to a stop. He lowered the window and took a steadying breath, his fingers already reaching for his wallet. In the patrol car behind him, Officer Travis Coleman leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the sleek luxury vehicle. Coleman was a veteran cop, but not the kind who earned respect. His record was littered with complaints. Excessive force, racial profiling, questionable searches. But the system had always shielded him. He knew how to play it, how to frame his actions just within the boundaries of plausible deniability. Mercedes late at night, he muttered to himself, stepping out of the cruiser. Let's see who we've got here. The crunch of his boots on the pavement was slow and deliberate, each step calculated to project authority. Coleman adjusted his belt as he approached the driver's side window, his flashlight cutting through the dark interior of the car. Marcus squinted against the light, his calm exterior masking the unease building inside him. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone neutral and measured. Coleman ignored the question, his flashlight lingering on Marcus's face longer than necessary. He noted the tailored suit, the expensive watch glinting on Marcus's wrist. His lip curled slightly. "License and registration," Coleman barked. Marcus handed over the documents without hesitation, his movements deliberate and precise. He knew the drill. He'd been in this position before, far too many times for his liking. Coleman took the documents, his eyes scanning them briefly before freezing on the name. "Whitfield," he said, drawing the syllables out slowly. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but it wasn't the respectful kind. "Yes, that's correct," Marcus replied evenly. Coleman's grip on the documents tightened. He tossed them back through the window without another glance. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus blinked, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me? May I ask why?" "I said step out of the vehicle." Coleman's voice rose, sharp and commanding. Marcus exhaled slowly. He had no illusions about where this could lead. Arguing with an officer like Coleman alone on a dark highway wasn't just risky. It could be fatal. He opened the door and stepped out, his hands visible at all times. Coleman watched him closely, his flashlight sweeping over Marcus's form as if searching for a reason to escalate. "Nice car," Coleman remarked, circling the Mercedes like a predator. His fingers trailed over the polished metal. "Bet it costs more than I make in a year." Marcus said nothing. He stood by the driver's side door, his posture calm but alert. Coleman stopped in front of him, standing just close enough to invade Marcus's space. "So, Judge Whitfield," he said, spitting the title like an insult. "Where are you headed tonight?" "Home," Marcus replied simply. "Home," Coleman repeated mockingly. "You know, people like you always think you can just do whatever you want. Break the rules. Cheat the system." Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. He knew Coleman wasn't just talking about him as an individual. He was talking about everything Marcus represented. Success, respect, a black man who had risen above the constraints of a system designed to hold him back. "Is there a reason for this stop, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice firm but controlled. Coleman's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Reason? Sure. Suspicious behavior." Marcus's jaw clenched. He knew this game. The vague language, the arbitrary accusations. It was all part of a script Coleman had perfected over the years. As the officer continued to circle the car, Marcus felt a prickle of unease. Coleman's demeanor was more than just hostile. It was personal. "Open the trunk," Coleman ordered abruptly. Marcus frowned. "I don't consent to a search." Coleman's smirk disappeared, replaced by a hard, predatory glare. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "You refusing a lawful order?" The air between them crackled with tension. Marcus met Coleman's gaze, refusing to back down. In that moment, the quiet night seemed to hold its breath, as if the stars themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. The silence of the empty highway was deafening as the two men stood face to face. For Marcus Whitfield, it was a silence he had known for far too long, the kind that surrounded moments when the weight of systemic bias pressed down like an invisible hand, choking reason and justice. For Officer Travis Coleman, it was a silence he relished, a vacuum where his authority was absolute, where the boundaries of right and wrong blurred under the glow of his flashing lights. Marcus could feel the gravel under his shoes as he shifted his weight slightly, his body tense but composed. He wasn't a stranger to conflict, having spent decades navigating courtrooms where stakes were high and tensions palpable. But this was different. There were no witnesses here, no jury to appeal to, just him and a man whose authority was backed by a badge and a loaded gun. "Open the trunk," Coleman repeated, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "I don't consent to searches without probable cause," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You know that as well as I do, officer." Coleman's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. This wasn't going the way he wanted. He'd expected fear, submission. Instead, he was met with calm defiance, and it infuriated him. "You want to play it that way, huh?" Coleman sneered. He stepped back, radioing into his shoulder mic. "Unit 42 requesting backup, possible 1031. Marcus's stomach turned. A 1031. That was police code for a suspected crime in progress. A blatant escalation. Marcus could see what was happening. Coleman was laying the groundwork to justify whatever he planned to do next. "Backup? For a traffic stop?" Marcus asked, his tone edged with incredulity. "You never know," Coleman said with a shrug. "Sometimes people like you carry surprises." "People like me," Marcus echoed, his voice sharp now. Coleman smirked but didn't respond. Instead, he began pacing slowly around the car again, his flashlight sweeping over every inch of the vehicle. The light lingered on the trunk, then the wheels, before moving to the passenger side window. For a brief moment, Marcus considered pulling out his phone to record the interaction. But he knew how that could be interpreted. He also knew how quickly things could spiral if Coleman decided to push further. The sound of distant sirens broke the tense stillness, growing louder with each passing second. Backup was on its way. Marcus's pulse quickened. Coleman's smirk widened as the sirens drew nearer. "See? It's always better to have witnesses." Marcus's mind raced. He had nothing to hide, but this wasn't about evidence or facts. This was about power, about humiliation. Marcus had fought too hard and come too far to be intimidated. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, he had witnessed firsthand the way people in his community were targeted by law enforcement. His father, a factory worker, had been arrested and beaten for a crime he didn't commit. The memory of his father's bruised face and shattered dignity had fueled Marcus's determination to change the system from within. After earning scholarships to prestigious schools, Marcus had risen through the ranks of the legal system, eventually becoming one of the youngest federal judges in the country. His rulings on civil rights cases had made headlines, earning him both praise and enemies. He wasn't just a judge, he was a symbol of what could be achieved in the face of adversity. But symbols could be polarizing, and he knew it. There were those who respected his work and those, like Coleman, who saw him as a threat. Travis Coleman had been a cop for nearly 2 decades. He had joined the force out of a desire for control, not justice. Growing up in a family that revered law enforcement, he had learned early on that a badge was a shield, not just against danger, but against accountability. His career had been marked by controversy. Complaints of excessive force and racial profiling were buried under mountains of paperwork. Thanks to the blue wall of silence that protected officers like him, Coleman had learned how to manipulate the system to his advantage, skirting just close enough to the edge to intimidate without consequences. But deep down, he despised people like Marcus Whitfield. To him, Marcus was a challenge to the natural order, proof that the system he upheld wasn't as invincible as he wanted to believe. 2 squad cars pulled up, their lights casting an eerie glow over the highway. 4 officers stepped out, their faces shadowed, but their postures alert. Marcus stood his ground, his heart pounding as he assessed the new arrivals. "Evening, gentlemen," Coleman said, his tone casual but laced with authority. "This one's giving me trouble. Won't let me search his car." One of the officers, a younger man with a hesitant expression, glanced at Marcus and then at Coleman. "What's the reason for the stop?" he asked. "Suspicious activity," Coleman replied smoothly. Marcus interjected, his voice steady. "I've complied with every request. I've given my license and registration. There's no probable cause for a search." The younger officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between Coleman and Marcus. Coleman shot him a sharp look, a silent warning to fall in line. The other officers moved closer, their presence adding to the suffocating tension. Marcus's mind raced, searching for a way to de-escalate without compromising his principles. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Coleman said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Just open the trunk, and we'll all be on our way." But Marcus knew better. He knew that giving in wouldn't end this. It would only embolden Coleman to push further. "I won't consent to an illegal search," Marcus said, his voice firm. For a moment, the standoff seemed frozen in time. The tension crackled like static in the air, and all eyes were on Marcus. The flashing lights painted his face in alternating shades of red and blue, a portrait of quiet defiance against an overwhelming force. The silence stretched thin as the officers exchanged uneasy glances. The younger officer, whose badge read R. Daniels, shifted his weight uncomfortably. It was clear he wasn't entirely convinced by Coleman's narrative, but the unspoken rule of loyalty within the force held him in check. Coleman, sensing the hesitation, stepped closer to Marcus. His shadow loomed larger now, accentuated by the rotating lights. "Listen here, Judge," he spat the title with mocking disdain. "You might be used to giving orders in your cushy courtroom, but out here the law answers to me." Marcus held his ground, his pulse pounding in his ears. "And I expect you to uphold that law, officer. This isn't how it works. I've done nothing wrong." Coleman smirked, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in closer. "We'll see about that." Without warning, Coleman turned to Daniels and barked, "Cover me. I'm searching the vehicle." Daniels hesitated. "But you got a problem, rookie?" Coleman's tone was ice, and Daniels stiffened, stepping aside with clear reluctance. Marcus's voice cut through the tension. "You have no right to do this. I haven't consented, and you don't have probable cause." Coleman ignored him, moving toward the driver's side door. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline and took a step forward. "You're overstepping," Marcus said, louder now, his tone sharp and commanding. "This will not end well for you." Coleman froze for a moment, then turned back slowly, his hand brushing his holster. Was that a threat? Marcus's stomach twisted. Coleman was baiting him, twisting the narrative to fit whatever story he needed to justify his actions. "It's a statement of fact," Marcus said, his voice even despite the turmoil inside him. Coleman laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "You think your title makes you untouchable? Out here, it doesn't mean a damn thing." The situation was spiraling quickly, but then another set of headlights appeared in the distance. The car slowed as it approached the scene, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope when he saw a man step out wearing a suit and tie. It was Detective Ray Johnson, a black officer from Internal Affairs who had been investigating corruption within the department. Johnson had been tipped off earlier that day about Coleman's escalating behavior and had decided to follow up in person after hearing Coleman's call for backup. "What's going on here?" Johnson asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Coleman's face hardened. "Routine traffic stop, detective. Got ourselves a non-compliant driver." Johnson's sharp eyes darted between Marcus and Coleman, quickly assessing the situation. He knew Coleman's reputation well. His name had appeared in multiple reports that Johnson was compiling for an internal review. "Non-compliant?" Johnson asked, his tone skeptical. "This man looks calm to me." Coleman stiffened. "With all due respect, detective, this is my stop. I've got it under control." "I'll be the judge of that," Johnson replied, his gaze steady. He turned to Marcus. "Sir, are you okay?" Marcus nodded. "I am now, Thank you for asking. Johnson stepped closer to Coleman, lowering his voice so only the two of them could hear. You don't want to do this, Coleman. You know the heat you're already under. Walk away now, and we can forget this happened. Coleman's jaw tightened. He glanced at the other officers, then at Marcus before stepping back. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. But don't think this is over. As Johnson started to de-escalate the situation, Marcus's relief was short-lived. One of the other officers, emboldened by Coleman's hostility, opened the trunk of Marcus's car without permission. Hey! Marcus shouted, stepping forward. Johnson spun around. What are you doing? He didn't consent to that? The officer hesitated, but it was too late. His flashlight illuminated the trunk, and his expression shifted from smug to surprised. Inside, tucked beneath a blanket, was a small black bag. What's this? The officer muttered, pulling the bag out and unzipping it. The air grew heavy as the officer revealed the contents, several tightly wrapped bundles that could easily be mistaken for contraband. Marcus's heart sank. He recognized the tactic instantly. That's not mine, Marcus said firmly, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing. Johnson stepped forward, snatching the bag from the officer. He examined the contents carefully, his expression unreadable. Coleman, seeing an opportunity, stepped back into the spotlight. Well, Judge. Looks like you've been caught red-handed. You planted that. Marcus shot back, his voice rising for the first time. Coleman shrugged, his smirk returning. Hard to prove that, isn't it? Johnson locked eyes with Marcus. Sir, do you mind if I search your car? I promise this will be handled by the book. Marcus hesitated, but then nodded. Go ahead. As Johnson carefully inspected the car, the weight of the situation bore down on everyone present. The other officers remained silent, their earlier bravado replaced with unease. Coleman, however, stood confidently, his arms crossed as if he had already won. But then Johnson emerged from the passenger side, holding something up. It was a small body camera, one that had been wedged under the seat, likely forgotten in Coleman's rush to orchestrate his scheme. Well, isn't this interesting? Johnson said, his voice calm but laced with purpose. Coleman's smirk faltered. That's nothing. Probably left there by another suspect. Johnson ignored him, reviewing the footage on the device. As the seconds ticked by, his expression grew darker. Finally, he looked up. This camera caught everything, Johnson said, his voice cold. He turned to Marcus. And you were right. That bag, it was planted. The weight of Detective Johnson's words hung in the air. The quiet hum of cicadas in the distance was the only sound as every pair of eyes shifted to Coleman. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by a tight, defiant glare. Turn that off, Coleman snapped, gesturing to the body camera in Johnson's hand. Johnson shook his head slowly, his grip on the camera firm. Not a chance. He turned to the other officers, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. This stops now, all of it. One of the officers, Daniels, finally found his voice. Detective, if what you're saying is true, it's career-ending. Johnson interrupted, his tone sharp. For anyone who sides with him. Daniels stepped back, his jaw tight. Coleman's gaze darted to him, silently daring the younger officer to act against him. You're making a mistake, Ray, Coleman growled, taking a step forward. This is bigger than you. Oh, I know, Johnson said, his voice dangerously calm. It's bigger than me, and it's about to come crashing down on you. As Johnson carefully placed the camera into an evidence bag, his mind raced. This wasn't just about Coleman. It was about a system that allowed men like him to thrive. The corruption, the silence, the complicity, it was all interconnected, and he knew that exposing Coleman would set off a chain reaction. But there was a risk. Johnson's investigation into the department's corruption had already ruffled feathers. He'd been warned, subtly and not so subtly, to back off. His superiors had hinted that his job and his life could become very uncomfortable if he kept digging. Johnson glanced at Marcus, who stood tall despite the weight of the situation. The judge's calm determination was both inspiring and sobering. I'll need you to come with me, Judge Whitfield, Johnson said, for your protection and to file a formal statement. This isn't over yet. Marcus nodded. I understand. What about him? Marcus asked, gesturing to Coleman. Johnson hesitated. For now, he walks. I don't have the authority to arrest him here without additional support. Coleman grinned, the defiance returning to his face. That's right. You don't. But I have enough to ensure you'll never wear that badge again. Johnson shot back, his words slicing through Coleman's confidence like a blade. Johnson and Marcus left the scene together, driving to the Internal Affairs office under the cover of darkness. As the squad cars disappeared in the rearview mirror, Marcus couldn't shake the tension coiled in his chest. "This won't stop with him," Marcus said quietly, staring out the window. "You know that, right?" Johnson nodded. "It never does. But this is a start." At the station, Marcus provided his statement, recounting every detail of the stop. Johnson secured the body camera footage and began the process of filing an official report. But even as they worked, the reality of what lay ahead loomed large. Word of the incident spread quickly. By the next morning, social media was ablaze with whispers of the confrontation. An anonymous tip, likely from one of the hesitant officers on the scene, leaked details of Coleman's behavior and the discovery of the planted evidence. A hashtag began trending: "Justice for Judge Whitfield." Coleman, meanwhile, was anything but idle. Knowing his career was in jeopardy, he reached out to his network within the department: friends, former partners, and even superiors, all people who had benefited from the same system of silence and protection. "We can't let this get out of hand," Coleman said during a late-night meeting with a group of officers in a dimly lit diner. "If Whitfield and Johnson win, they'll come after all of us." "What are you suggesting?" one of the officers asked cautiously. "We fight back," Coleman growled. "They want a war. We'll give them one." As the days passed, Marcus became the center of a media storm. His face was plastered across news channels, and reporters camped outside his home and office, demanding statements. He remained composed in public, but privately, the weight of the situation bore down on him. Threats began to trickle in: emails, anonymous letters, even a brick through the window of his office. Each act of intimidation was a reminder of the forces aligned against him. Johnson faced his own pressures. Fellow officers shunned him, whispering behind his back or openly confronting him in the precinct. He found graffiti on his car one morning: "Rat." But the body camera footage couldn't be silenced. It was undeniable. And when Johnson leaked a redacted version to the press, the public outcry was deafening. While Coleman and his allies worked to suppress the fallout, Marcus and Johnson found unexpected support from the community. Civil rights organizations rallied behind Marcus, organizing marches and press conferences to demand accountability. One evening, Marcus stood before a crowd of thousands at a rally in downtown Chicago. The faces before him were a tapestry of diversity: black, white, young, old, all united by a shared demand for justice. "I am not just standing here for myself," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I am standing here for every person who has been silenced, every person who has been told they are less than. This fight is not just mine, it's ours." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. Meanwhile, Coleman's desperation grew. With his career on the line, he began taking riskier actions to undermine the investigation. Anonymous leaks painted Marcus as a corrupt official, while whispers of Johnson's agenda spread through the department like wildfire. But the truth was stronger. Johnson's investigation revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond Coleman. As more officers came forward, the scale of the cover-up became undeniable. The tension reached its breaking point on a cold, rainy evening a week after the traffic stop. Marcus Whitfield was leaving a town hall meeting where he had spoken passionately about the need for accountability and reform within law enforcement. The room had erupted in applause, but as he walked out into the damp night, flanked by two aides, the air felt heavier than usual. Detective Ray Johnson was waiting near Marcus's car, his eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced vigilance. The threats against both of them had increased in frequency and severity, and Johnson wasn't taking any chances. "Judge, let me escort you home," Johnson said as Marcus approached. Marcus nodded. Probably a good idea. As they climbed into the car, Marcus in the back seat and Johnson at the wheel, a dark sedan pulled out from the shadows of a nearby alley. Its headlights remained off, but its engine rumbled ominously. Johnson noticed it immediately. "Hold on," he said, his voice tight. The sedan lurched forward, cutting them off before Johnson could pull out of the parking lot. 4 men stepped out, all wearing dark clothing and masks. Marcus's stomach dropped as he recognized one of the men by his build and gait. It was Travis Coleman. "Stay in the car," Johnson ordered, stepping out into the rain. Coleman smirked as he approached. The dim streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting long shadows around them. "Evening, detective. Out late, aren't you?" "Back off, Coleman," Johnson growled. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Coleman chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "See, that's where you're wrong. I've got nothing to lose. You, on the other hand, you're in over your head." The other men spread out, their stances aggressive. Marcus, watching from the back seat, pulled out his phone and started recording, his hands steady despite the fear gnawing at his chest. "This is harassment, Coleman," Johnson said, taking a step forward, "and it's all being documented. Walk away now, or I'll have more than enough to bury you." Coleman's smirk faltered for a moment, but then he gestured to one of his men. The thug pulled a crowbar from under his jacket and began approaching the car. Johnson moved to intercept him, his hand on his holstered weapon. "Don't even think about it." "What's the plan here, Coleman?" Marcus called out from inside the car. "Intimidation? Violence? You think that's going to stop me from speaking the truth?" Coleman turned to face Marcus, his expression dark. "You've made yourself a symbol, Judge, but symbols can be broken." Before Coleman's men could act, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the night. Bright red and blue lights lit up the street, reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement. Coleman froze, his eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Unmarked vehicles screeched to a halt, and a dozen officers in tactical gear poured out, weapons drawn. At their lead was Captain Maria Alvarez, head of the department's Internal Affairs Division. "Drop your weapons," Alvarez shouted. "Hands where I can see them." Coleman's face twisted in rage as he realized he'd been set up. Johnson stepped back, his smirk now matching Coleman's earlier bravado. "You really thought I'd let you walk away after what you've done?" Johnson said, his voice steady. "You're done, Coleman." The men with Coleman hesitated, then dropped their weapons as the officers closed in. Coleman, however, refused to comply. His hand twitched toward his waistband, but before he could act, Alvarez's team tackled him to the ground. As he was cuffed, Coleman spat at Marcus, his voice a venomous snarl. "This isn't over." Marcus stepped out of the car, his face calm despite the storm raging around him. He looked down at Coleman, who was now drenched and restrained. "Oh, it's over," Marcus said firmly. The arrest of Travis Coleman made national headlines the next morning. The body camera footage, combined with Marcus's and Johnson's testimonies, painted a damning picture, not just of Coleman, but of a larger system of corruption. Alvarez's team moved quickly, conducting raids and interrogations that led to the suspension and eventual indictment of several high-ranking officers. The department's dirty laundry was aired in public, and the community's outrage was swift and unrelenting. Civil rights leaders praised Marcus for his bravery, and Johnson became a reluctant hero in his own right. But both men knew the fight wasn't over. Sitting in his office a week later, Marcus read through a stack of letters. Some were from supporters thanking him for his courage. Others were from people who felt betrayed by a system they believed was now targeting law enforcement. Johnson entered the room, dropping a thick file on Marcus's desk. "Coleman's trial date is set," he said, "and Alvarez thinks we've got enough to bring down everyone connected to him." Marcus nodded. "Good. It's a start." "You think it'll be enough?" Johnson asked, leaning against the desk. Marcus met his gaze, his expression thoughtful. "It has to be." As the two men spoke, a notification popped up on Marcus's phone. It was a news alert. "Breaking. New evidence suggests deeper cover-up in police corruption scandal." Marcus sighed. "Looks like we're not done yet." Johnson smirked. "Were we ever?" The camera footage of Coleman's takedown went viral, and the fallout rippled through the country. Protests erupted, demanding accountability at every level of law enforcement. For Marcus, the fight for justice became more than just a personal battle. It became a movement. But in the shadows, those loyal to Coleman and the old system began regrouping, plotting their next move. The ripple effects of Travis Coleman's arrest were immediate and far-reaching. The city's police department was thrust into the national spotlight, becoming a symbol of a justice system at war with itself. Every newscast, every social media platform buzzed with updates, leaks, and debates. For every person applauding the courage of Marcus Whitfield and Ray Johnson, there was someone else crying foul, accusing them of vilifying law enforcement. Within days, the police department announced sweeping internal reviews. Officers suspected of being complicit in Coleman's network were placed on administrative leave, and some resigned preemptively, fearing the inevitable storm. Captain Maria Alvarez, bolstered by the newfound momentum, promised that no stone would be left unturned. But the process of reform came with costs. Protests erupted across the city, with thousands taking to the streets. Many carried signs bearing Marcus's image with slogans like "Justice for All" and "No one is above the law." Civil rights leaders, clergy, and community organizers rallied together, using the moment to call for broader reforms beyond the police department. Yet, there were counter-protests as well. Groups of people, many waving flags and wearing insignias that hinted at their affiliations, painted Marcus and Johnson as enemies of law enforcement. They claimed the exposure of Coleman's crimes was part of a broader anti-police agenda. One night, a particularly heated confrontation unfolded outside City Hall. Protesters demanding accountability clashed with counter-protesters who accused them of disrespecting law enforcement. Police were forced to intervene, and several arrests were made. In his private moments, Marcus watched the news with a heavy heart. He understood the backlash. Change never came easily, and those clinging to the old ways often resisted the hardest. The threats against Marcus became more frequent and brazen. His home was vandalized, spray-painted with slurs and threats. Anonymous emails flooded his inbox, some filled with vitriol, others with chilling specificity about his movements. One evening, while returning from court, Marcus noticed a black SUV tailing him for several blocks. He took a detour through a crowded area before heading to the police station, where Johnson was waiting. "They're trying to scare you," Johnson said after Marcus recounted the incident. "And it's working." Marcus sighed, exhaustion etched into his face. "I've dealt with intimidation before, Ray, but this feels different. It's not just about me anymore." Johnson nodded. "You're right. This is about what you represent, and that scares them more than anything." Within the police department, the cracks began to show. Many officers supported the reforms, tired of the toxic culture that had flourished under Coleman's influence. But others resented the investigations, seeing them as a betrayal. Johnson became a pariah in his own precinct. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. His locker was vandalized with the word "traitor" scrawled in black marker. But the quiet hostility was nothing compared to the whispers he overheard. Rumors of officers loyal to Coleman, who were working behind the scenes to undermine the investigations. One day, Johnson confronted Captain Alvarez in her office. "We've got a problem," he said, dropping a file on her desk. "What now?" Alvarez asked, scanning the papers. "There's a group of officers who aren't just resisting. They're actively sabotaging. Evidence is going missing. Witnesses are getting scared off. They're circling the wagons." Alvarez's face darkened. "We can't let this happen. If we back down now, we lose everything." "I'm with you," Johnson said. "But we need to move fast. They're not just playing defense anymore. They're going on the attack." The growing tension came to a head 2 weeks later. Marcus was speaking at a community center, addressing a crowd of activists, students, and local leaders. As he spoke about the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity, a commotion erupted near the back of the room. A man in a hoodie pushed through the crowd, shouting incoherently. Before anyone could react, he pulled a gun from his pocket and pointed it at Marcus. Time seemed to slow, as the room erupted into chaos. Johnson, who had been standing near the stage, lunged forward, tackling Marcus to the ground just as the gunman fired. The bullet missed by inches, embedding itself in the wall behind them. The gunman was subdued by security, and Marcus was quickly whisked away to safety. But the incident left the city shaken. The attempt on Marcus's life became a rallying cry. The next day, thousands gathered in the streets, demanding swift justice and greater protection for those fighting corruption. Even some of Marcus's critics condemned the attack, acknowledging that violence against him only proved the depth of the problem. But for Marcus, the incident was a sobering reminder of the stakes. Sitting in his home that night, flanked by security, he spoke to Johnson. "They'll do anything to hold on to their power," Marcus said. Johnson nodded. "And we'll do whatever it takes to break it." Captain Alvarez accelerated her investigations, launching raids on properties connected to Coleman's allies. A treasure trove of evidence was uncovered: hidden bank accounts, forged reports, and recordings implicating high-ranking officials. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined, reaching into city politics and beyond. Alvarez's findings were handed over to federal prosecutors, and the case became one of the largest corruption investigations in the state's history. Travis Coleman faced a litany of charges: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and more. During his trial, the body camera footage was played in court, and the jury watched as his smug arrogance dissolved into desperation. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His conviction sent shockwaves through the police department, serving as both a warning and a vindication. The weeks following Travis Coleman's conviction marked a new chapter for Marcus Whitfield and Detective Ray Johnson. The city, still grappling with the revelations of corruption, began to slowly rebuild trust in its institutions. But for Marcus and Ray, the road to recovery was anything but simple. Marcus stood in the living room of his modest home, looking out the window at the small group of protesters gathered across the street. Though their numbers had dwindled, their signs still bore accusatory slogans: "Stop vilifying cops," and "Judges should stay in courtrooms." Despite the noise, Marcus felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in weeks. The attempts to intimidate him had failed. He had survived the worst and emerged stronger. That evening, Marcus returned to the stage, this time as the keynote speaker at a national civil rights conference. The auditorium was packed, and the energy in the room was palpable. As Marcus approached the podium, the applause was deafening. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. Students, activists, lawyers, families, all united in their demand for justice. "When we talk about justice," Marcus began, his voice resonant and steady, "we're not just talking about laws and courts. We're talking about the soul of our society. And when that soul is sick, when it's corrupted by greed, prejudice, and abuse of power, it's up to us to heal it." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Marcus raised a hand to quiet them. "This fight is not over," he continued. "It's bigger than one judge, one detective, or one city. It's about the lives that were lost, the families that were torn apart, and the communities that were abandoned. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their title or position, is above the law." By the time Marcus finished his speech, the audience was on their feet, chanting his name. He had become more than a judge. He was now a symbol of hope for a nation desperate for change. Ray Johnson sat in the precinct's break room, his coffee untouched as he reviewed a stack of case files. The atmosphere in the station was tense. Some officers refused to even acknowledge his presence. But Ray had allies too. Officers who had grown tired of the corruption approached him quietly, offering information and pledging their support. For the first time in years, Ray felt that his work was making a difference. One afternoon, Captain Maria Alvarez pulled him aside. "You've done good work, Ray," she said, her tone uncharacteristically warm. "But I need you to be ready for what's coming next." "What's that?" he asked. Alvarez slid a folder across the desk. Inside were the details of a new task force dedicated to rooting out systemic corruption across the state. "I want you to lead this," she said. Ray blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. "Me? Why?" "Because you've proven you're not afraid to do the right thing, even when it's hard," Alvarez replied. "That's the kind of leadership we need right now." Ray accepted the role, knowing it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The city began to change, albeit slowly. New initiatives were introduced to improve police accountability, including mandatory body cameras and independent oversight boards. Community leaders and police representatives held town hall meetings to rebuild trust, and Marcus was a frequent speaker. One evening during a meeting in a church basement, a young man stood up to address Marcus. "Judge Whitfield," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "My brother. He didn't survive his encounter with the police, but seeing you fight back gives me hope. It makes me think maybe things can get better." Marcus approached the young man, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said sincerely, "and I promise you, we won't stop until there's justice for everyone." Amid the chaos, Marcus found himself reflecting on his own journey. For years he had fought to make a difference from behind the bench, believing that his rulings were enough to effect change. But the events of the past months had shown him that true justice required more. He began to mentor young law students, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to fight for equity in the legal system. He also reconnected with his family, realizing how much he had neglected them during his climb to success. Ray, too, experienced growth. Though he had always prided himself on being a good cop, the ordeal with Coleman forced him to confront his own complicity. He sought therapy to process the guilt and trauma of working in a corrupt system, and he became an outspoken advocate for mental health resources for officers. 6 months after Coleman's conviction, Marcus and Ray stood together at the grand opening of a new community justice center. Funded by donations and grants, the center aimed to provide free legal aid, education, and resources for underserved communities. "This is what justice looks like," Marcus said during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "It's not just about punishing the guilty, it's about empowering the innocent." Ray nodded beside him, feeling a rare sense of hope. For all the pain and loss, there was also progress. As the city celebrated the strides made in reform and accountability, a shadow loomed on the horizon. Travis Coleman, though convicted and sentenced, remained a rallying symbol for those within the police force and beyond who felt emboldened to resist change. Behind bars, Coleman's influence persisted, and his allies, some still within the department, were determined to restore their version of order. Detective Ray Johnson, now leading the corruption task force, had received several warnings from confidential sources. Documents and tips revealed that a coordinated effort was underway to disrupt the ongoing reforms, silence key witnesses, and even sabotage the newly formed community justice initiatives. Late one evening, Ray sat alone in his office, surrounded by stacks of case files. Most of his team had gone home, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something critical was being overlooked. As he sifted through yet another folder, a handwritten note slipped out. It was unsigned, but its message was clear. "The fight isn't over. Stay out of it while you still can." Ray stared at the note, his jaw tightening. The threat wasn't new, but this one felt different. It wasn't just aimed at him. It was a warning that the progress they had made was hanging by a thread. Determined to uncover the truth, Ray turned his focus to a recent string of unusual events. A break-in at the Community Justice Center where Marcus frequently worked. Nothing had been stolen, but documents had been rifled through. An alarming number of witnesses in Coleman's corruption network retracting their testimonies. An intercepted communication suggesting that a high-ranking official within the department was working behind the scenes to derail the task force. Ray knew he had to act quickly. He picked up the phone and called Marcus. Marcus was at home, reviewing case files for an upcoming civil rights hearing, when Ray's call came through. "Ray, it's late. What's going on?" Marcus asked, sensing the urgency in his friend's voice. "We've got a problem," Ray replied. "Coleman's network isn't done. They're regrouping, and I think they're planning something big." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean? What kind of something?" "I don't know yet," Ray admitted. "But it's organized, and it's coming from higher up than we thought. Someone's protecting them, Marcus. Someone with real power." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling on him. "We've come too far for this to unravel now," he said firmly. "Agreed," Ray said. "But we need to play this smart. If we overplay our hand, they'll use it against us." The next morning, Marcus arrived at the Justice Center to find the building surrounded by protesters. This time, the signs weren't just critical. They were hostile. Slogans like "Traitors to the badge" and "Defund the judges" were scrawled across hastily made banners. Inside, Marcus met with the center's staff, many of whom were visibly shaken. "They're getting bolder," said Tanya, a young attorney who had been working closely with Marcus. "I've had 3 clients cancel appointments this week because they're afraid of being targeted." "We won't let fear win," Marcus said, his voice steady. "If we back down now, they'll take everything we've built." That evening, as Marcus and Ray met at a local diner to strategize, a black SUV parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, but both men could feel the weight of its presence. "They're watching us," Marcus said quietly. Ray nodded. "Let them. It means we're getting close." 2 days later, a man approached Ray outside the precinct. He wore plain clothes and kept his head low, but there was a nervous energy about him. "You don't know me," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know what you're up against." Ray eyed him warily. "And who are you?" "Let's just say I used to be part of Coleman's inner circle," the man replied. "I'm done protecting him, but I can't do this publicly. If they find out I talked to you, they won't," Ray assured him. "What do you have for me?" The man handed over a small USB drive. "Everything, names, locations, plans. It's all on there. But you didn't get it from me." Before Ray could ask more, the man disappeared into the crowd. Back at the task force's headquarters, Ray plugged the USB into a secure computer. The files contained a treasure trove of information. Details of secret meetings between Coleman's allies and department officials. A list of officers and politicians receiving bribes to obstruct the investigations. Evidence of a planned attack on the Community Justice Center during an upcoming rally. Ray immediately called Marcus. "We've got them," Ray said. "But it's worse than I thought. They're planning something at the rally next week. We need to act fast." With the rally just days away, Marcus and Ray worked with Captain Alvarez to devise a plan. The task force would quietly deploy undercover officers to monitor the event, while Alvarez secured a warrant to arrest key players implicated in the USB files. But the stakes were higher than ever. If the plan failed, not only would the reform efforts suffer, but lives could be at risk. On the night before the rally, Marcus addressed his team at the Justice Center. "We've faced threats before," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "But this time, we're ready. Tomorrow, we show them that justice is not just a word, it's an action, and it cannot be silenced." The day of the rally arrived with an air of anticipation and tension. Thousands of people gathered at the Community Justice Center, their voices echoing through the streets as they chanted for change. Marcus Whitfield stood at the heart of the event, surrounded by supporters, colleagues, and volunteers. For many, he was more than a judge. He was a symbol of resilience and hope. Detective Ray Johnson was positioned nearby, dressed inconspicuously to blend in with the crowd. His sharp eyes scanned the faces around him, searching for anything, or anyone, out of place. Around the perimeter, plainclothes officers from Captain Alvarez's task force were stationed, each carrying out their role in the carefully orchestrated plan. In the crowd, the tension was palpable. Protesters waved signs, their chants growing louder, but there was an undercurrent of unease. Marcus, standing at the podium, adjusted the microphone and began his speech. As Marcus spoke, Ray caught sight of a man near the back of the crowd. He matched the description of one of Coleman's known associates from the USB files, a man identified as a key player in the planned attack. Ray moved closer, signaling discreetly to Alvarez's team. The suspect was shifting nervously, his hand hovering near the pocket of his jacket. Marcus's voice rang out over the crowd. "Today, we stand united against corruption, against fear, and against those who seek to divide us. Justice is not a privilege, it is a right, and we will not be silenced." The crowd erupted in applause, but Ray's attention remained fixed on the suspect. He saw the man mutter something into a small device, and a second figure emerged from the shadows, weaving through the sea of people. "Alvarez, we've got movement," Ray said into his earpiece. The second figure pulled a device from his bag, a makeshift smoke bomb. Within seconds, a thick cloud of gray smoke began to spread through the crowd, causing panic. People screamed and scattered as the smoke enveloped them, and in the confusion, the first suspect began pushing toward the stage. Ray acted immediately, shoving through the chaos as he yelled into his radio. "The stage! They're targeting Marcus!" Marcus, momentarily blinded by the smoke, felt a rush of panic as the crowd surged around him. He was pulled to the side by one of his aides, but the suspect was closing in fast. Ray reached the stage just as the suspect drew a concealed weapon. Without hesitation, Ray tackled him to the ground, the gun skidding out of reach. "Get Marcus out of here," Ray shouted to Alvarez, who had arrived with reinforcements. Alvarez signaled her officers to move Marcus to safety while she secured the scene. But even as they arrested the first suspect, more figures emerged from the smoke, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Near the edge of the chaos, one of Coleman's allies, a man identified as his second-in-command, stood watching, his expression calm and calculating. When Alvarez spotted him, she drew her weapon and approached. "You're done," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The man smirked. "You think taking me down will stop this? You're just scratching the surface." As Alvarez moved to cuff him, another accomplice lunged from behind, attempting to disarm her. A brief struggle ensued, but Alvarez's training kicked in, and she subdued both men with the help of her team. Despite the chaos, Marcus refused to leave. "I won't be silenced," he said, shaking off the hands of his aides. He climbed back onto the stage, his voice amplified over the lingering smoke and noise. "To those who seek to intimidate us, to silence us, I say this. You will not win. We will not back down. Justice will prevail. The crowd, emboldened by his defiance, rallied around him. Their chants grew louder, drowning out the remnants of the disruption. By the end of the day, over a dozen of Coleman's allies were arrested, and their plans to derail the rally had been thwarted. The evidence gathered during the operation tied several of them directly to Coleman, strengthening the case against his remaining network. As the sun set over the city, Marcus and Ray stood side by side, watching as the crowd began to disperse. You could have left, Ray said, his tone half scolding, half admiring. Marcus shook his head. They needed to see that we're not afraid. And they did, Ray replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That evening, Marcus appeared on a nationally televised broadcast. He recounted the events of the rally, using the platform to call for continued vigilance and action. This isn't just about one city or one department, Marcus said. This is about who we are as a society. Justice isn't passive, it's active. It requires us to stand up, to speak out, and to hold those in power accountable. His words resonated deeply, sparking a wave of renewed activism across the country. The arrests at the rally led to the dismantling of what remained of Coleman's network. Federal prosecutors launched broader investigations, and sweeping reforms were enacted to prevent similar corruption from taking root again. Ray continued to lead the task force, now with the full support of Captain Alvarez and an expanded team. Marcus, meanwhile, became a prominent advocate for systemic reform, using his influence to push for change on a national level. Months after the rally and the dramatic takedown of Travis Coleman's remaining network, the city was in a state of cautious optimism. While the scars of corruption and division still lingered, the steps toward healing were undeniable. The police department, once entrenched in secrecy and impunity, was undergoing a transformation. New leadership, stricter accountability measures, and an independent oversight board had begun to restore the public's trust. Officers who had operated in silence now felt emboldened to speak out, knowing they were no longer alone. For Marcus Whitfield and Ray Johnson, the journey had been transformative in ways they hadn't anticipated. Sitting in his office, Marcus stared out at the city skyline. His walls were lined with awards and plaques recognizing his achievements, but his thoughts weren't on accolades. They were on the people whose lives had been touched by the fight for justice. His phone buzzed with a message from Tanya, the young attorney at the Community Justice Center. It was a picture of a group of children at a new after-school program funded by the reforms Marcus had helped push through. "Justice starts here," the caption read. Marcus smiled, the weight of his responsibility feeling a little lighter. For years he had believed that his work on the bench was the pinnacle of his influence, but now he understood that his voice and his actions outside the courtroom carried just as much weight. Ray stood in the task force's bustling office, watching his team review files and prepare for the next round of investigations. The environment was different now. There was a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose that hadn't existed before. Captain Alvarez walked in, holding a cup of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, handing it to him. "Because I haven't," Ray replied with a tired grin. "But it's worth it." Alvarez nodded. "We're making progress. You should be proud of that." Ray thought about everything they'd accomplished and the cost it had come with. He thought about Marcus, the community, and the people they were fighting for. "It's not about pride," Ray said. "It's about doing what's right. That's the only thing that matters." Months turned into a year, and the impact of Marcus and Ray's work was undeniable. Reports showed a decline in excessive force complaints, and public confidence in law enforcement was steadily rising. Community outreach programs, funded by reallocated police budgets, were thriving. Marcus received an invitation to deliver the keynote address at a national symposium on justice reform. As he took the stage in front of thousands, he thought about the night on the highway that had changed everything. "Justice," he began, "is not a destination. It's a journey, a relentless pursuit of fairness, equity, and accountability. It's standing firm in the face of fear and refusing to be silenced, and it's a responsibility we all share." The audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the hall. That night, Marcus and Ray met at their usual diner, a quiet ritual they had developed over the months. The weight of their work was still there, but so was a sense of accomplishment. "To justice," Marcus said, raising his coffee mug. "To never backing down," Ray replied, clinking his mug against Marcus's. As they sat in the dimly lit booth, the city outside hummed with life. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time in a long while, they felt hope. In a small room in a federal prison, Travis Coleman sat alone, staring at a television screen. The news was covering Marcus Whitfield's latest speech, and the crowd's cheers were audible even through the thin walls. Coleman's jaw clenched as he turned away, his fists tightening. But outside those walls, the world had changed. His power was gone, and justice was no longer a tool for the privileged few. It was a movement for everyone. The story of Marcus Whitfield and Ray Johnson wasn't just about corruption or reform. It was about the resilience of the human spirit, the power of unity, and the belief that no matter how deep the darkness, the light of justice would always prevail.